So what are we going to look at? We're going to look at service charges, estimates, actuals. What are service charges? Calculating a service charge. How does Southampton, or for that matter, any landlord, social provider as Southampton is, calculate a new service charge when tenants exercise the right to buy? How do they calculate the service charge for that tenant who's now going to become a leaseholder? And how do they calculate or recalculate the service charge for existing leaseholders, i.e. yourselves in the room? Then we're going to look at what the exercise is that they carry out in finalising the charges at the end of the financial year. I'm also going to cover some of your rights with regards to service charges. When you actually receive a demand for service charges, you get something called a summary of tenants' rights and obligations. Okay, so that tells you pretty much what I'm going to tell you. Then moving on from service charges, the second half of this session is around lease extensions. There's new legislation out there, so I'll just raise your awareness of that. And then we'll move on to questions and answers and talk about the leasehold forum. So, but first of all, an introduction for me, for those people who weren't here last night. Been around for 30 years in social housing. The last 20 years have been with the Housing Quality. I'll give you details, the website that will be sent out to you on the slides of the Housing Quality Network. Background is anything home ownership related. So I deliver lots of training on leases, service charge account, consultation, right to buy, shared ownership, enforcing covenants, and I also carry out service reviews, and landlords might parachute me in to do and help them with related to home ownership. I also do some work for the Institute of Residential Property, not employed by them, but I do help them out in holding their workshops for people who are going to take their exams, them out preparing for those exams. So, service charge. What is a service charge? There is a list going to give you my sort of basic Janet and John definition for now. So, a landlord such as Sal provides a service for the benefit of tenants. By the way, leaseholders are tenants under the Landlord and Tenant Act. So landlord who provides a service for the benefit of tenants and in doing so incurs reasonable expenses, they've got to pay their contractors obviously, should be entitled to cover those expenses from the tenant. Or another way, flipping it on its head, the service charge is designed to allow the landlord, such as Southampton, to collect funds for the payment of those services that it must provide to lessees and tenants under the terms of the lease. Okay, so whatever the lease requires them and obliges them to do, they do that. But as I said last night, there are two sides of the lease: the obligations of the landlord, then the tenant, or the lease might talk about lessee, the requirement for the lessee to meet the costs that the landlord incurs in delivering those services or meeting its obligations. Legal definition is the Section 18 of the Landlord and Tenant Act. If you get really bored over COVID, service charge counting, the framework for service charge accounting is contained within Section 18 to 30 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 85. That's what Southampton, there's no wriggle room, they have to abide by that framework. They have to comply with those sections 18 to 30. So the legal definition under Section 18 is that a service charge means an amount payable by a tenant, and this, by the way, can be general needs tenants if they're paying a variable service charge, but lessees or tenants, as I've mentioned, means an amount payable by a tenant of a dwelling as part of or in addition to the rent. The rent can be a multitude of different rents. For you, it's just the ground rent. For tenants, general needs tenants, it is their rent. For shared owners, they pay a rent for part of the property they don't yet own. So this is an amount on top of that rent, whichever that rent might be. And it's payable directly or indirectly for certain things which form the service charge. So it's services, repairs, maintenance, improvements, if it's contained in the lease, or insurance, or the landlord's costs of management. And there's a second part to this, which really relates more to general needs tenants, and the whole or part of which varies or may vary according to the relevant costs. Under the terms of your lease, you pay a variable service charge. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is at the beginning of the year, Southampton may issue an estimate that the service charge is going to be £700. They get to the end of the financial year, and we'll come on to finalising shortly, get to the end of the financial year and they find that actually they've spent £800. Because you pay a variable service charge, it enables them to send you a balancing demand for that overspend of £100. And under the terms of the lease, they can require you pay that shortfall within the number of days at the terms of the lease. It might be 28 days. I can't recall what your lease says at the moment. And you would be required to pay that within that 28 days. The relevant costs for the service charge are the costs or the estimated costs that are incurred or to be incurred by the landlord. And it includes, as I say, overheads and management costs. So that's the definition, the legal definition of the service charge. Relevant costs may be relevant and taken into account if they are reasonably incurred. Now, Section 19 of that Landlord Tenant Act 1985 is about reasonableness. And what we mean by reasonably incurred is that Southampton can only charge you for things that it is obliged to do under the terms of the lease. It can do other things, other services, but unless it's referred to or loosely referred to under the terms of the lease, whilst they can provide those additional services, they can, because it is not reasonable to incur a cost for something that they're not required to do. Once you've gone beyond the reasonably incurred, then you talk about other reasonable tests, such as reasonable costs and reasonable standard. Reasonable doesn't mean the cheapest, by the way. Okay. So what can usually under the terms of the lease, and most often leases are constructed and well drafted to enable landlords to recover the costs of providing equipment, services, the maintenance to that equipment. If the lease allows, it will allow the landlord to recover the cost of improvements, to recover a management fee for managing and delivering and administering the services. If the lease allows, it will allow the landlord to recover an amount that they can keep in a fund and use that fund for long-term planned, what we were referring to last night as major works, things that happen a longer frequency. For instance, cyclical works perhaps, decoration, re-roofing, replacing things like lifts, etc. A reserve fund clause in the lease is a nice thing to have. I don't think you operate a reserve fund at Southampton. And then last night we were talking about major works costs, those big items, big ticket items. I've talked about roofs, window frames, replacement of lifts, mechanical and electrical. And that's not a complete list. A bit more detail though, a little bit more going into that list might look like in a bit more detail. So repairs and maintenance, we talked about responsibilities, who's responsible for what, and the lease dictates that, as we mentioned last night. What other services might Southampton be delivering to you, or providing rather? Cleaning, so they might have a caretaker service, or they might have an external contractor coming in to do the cleaning. Grounds maintenance across the estates, buildings insurance, and then all of the mechanical and electrical installations to the buildings, such as the lift, the door entry system, security, any car parking gates, TV aerials, any fire safety equipment, and they can recover the costs of any health and safety inspections, under fire regulations, Legionella, that's not on the list, but Legionella or asbestos, any arrangements for removing rubbish. And as I say, this isn't an exhaustive list. Actually, I quite liked, I looked at the estimate that Southampton gives you, and they have, what is it? The aircraft warning lighting. Never seen that before. That's quite unique just to Southampton, must be, but anyway. Surrounding estate, so if you are required to meet the costs of the estate, that would include or might include parking spaces, any garages, perhaps any communal or surrounding communal areas such as drying areas, lawns, walls, fences, etc., if the lease requires them to. Southampton doesn't charge for estate costs, so that's a big cost that you're not landed with. There's a reason why local authorities, some local authorities, don't charge for estate costs, and that's simply because the estate costs, because the estates are open and Joe Bloggs can walk through the estates, it was deemed unfair to put the costs of the grass cutting and the maintenance perhaps of any play areas onto the residents on the estate, when anybody can come and use the play area and anybody can walk across the grass. Those costs are usually taken out of what we call the general fund, which is funded by council tax money. Many local authorities now are struggling with that because the council tax money doesn't go far enough, and they're having to dip into what's termed as the housing revenue account. Housing revenue account is funded by tenants' rents and any service charge income. That's where the payments come out for contractors, etc. As I say, some local authorities are now having to revisit and to impose a charge to both tenants, not you, because your lease doesn't allow it, but for tenants to charge them a service charge. Southampton haven't gone down that road yet. It might come, but it won't impact on you because of the way your lease is currently drafted. Okay, so calculating the service charge for new leaseholders, that's where tenants are exercising the right to buy, and Southampton are now going to, these are tenants rather in flats, because we've already established that people in houses aren't paying an estate charge. So people in the flats, if they've got to calculate a service charge, how do they go about it? Well, first of all, they need to know what the lease is talking about. What will the lease oblige them to provide as a service? And they need to also look at what boundaries are going to be incorporated in the lease plan that attaches to the lease. What services will the leaseholder benefit from? We usually suggest that, that a visit to the scheme is carried out, just to have a visual inspection to see that, is there a door entry system, is there a lift, is there what services, what mechanical, electrical services are on the scheme. Because sometimes, particularly if the local authority hasn't what we call depooled all of the service charges for tenants, then just looking at what a tenant pays before they've exercised the right to buy may not be sound enough, because as I mentioned last night, some tenants can often have the service charges included in their rent. So just looking at what they pay as a service charge may not be robust enough as an exercise to inform what the leaseholder should pay once they've exercised the right to buy. We also advise that the organisation looks at, via the finance department, what monies are you spending? What monies, what services costs are you spending? And what have you been spending over the past few years to see what the average is, and then to usually add an inflation for the forthcoming years once the person has exercised the right to buy. If there are previous sales in the property, then it's an easy exercise, because you can just look at one I prepared earlier, Blue Peter. Yeah. So that's new leaseholders. But what about you? You're the existing leaseholders. So what happens for you? So financial year is the 1st of April to 31st of March, very typical of social housing providers. Most have that same financial year. So the exercise of estimating for April 21 has already started. Yeah, so it started back in November, and because it's a long process. Yeah, what Southampton will be doing back in November is collecting the costs that they incurred between 19 and 20. Okay, so last year November they were in 2021, financial year 2021. They hadn't completed the year, so they couldn't use actual costs then. So they've had to use 1920, but they also use actual costs in 2021 from the 1st of April up until November. So they've got a good, by that point, they'll probably have a good 6 months, may not have 7 months, because they'll still be waiting bills and invoices from the likes of utilities, etc. But usually have a good 6 months. So they've got actual for 1920 and 6 months at least of 2021. And they use those figures, those actual costs, to inform moving forward, particularly contract costs. They're very straightforward. They'll use those costs and then they'll add an uplift, because the contract terms usually have an uplift built into the contract. So that's part of the exercise, but in addition to that, they need to find out whether any unusual, exceptional spend will take place in 21-22. So the contract terms are one thing, but there may be something that hadn't been planned, but now has been foreseen for 21-22. In the home ownership department, because they're not actually spending the money, they're not the budget holders, they are purely the vehicle for gathering the information from other parts of the organisation who do spend the money and compiling it together. They need to ask those other parts of the business, what do you think you're likely to spend this year? What are your plans? Yeah, so I can't give you an example off the top of my head, but that's the exercise that they do. They contact all of the other providers of the services, the budget holders as we term them, and ask them the question, is anything unusual going to happen in 21-22 I need to be aware of and I need to advise leaseholders of? And they'll gather all of that information and then they start preparing those estimates. And it's not a straightforward thing. They've got to work with their IT. They've got to do test runs. It's a long, drawn-out affair. There is no housing management system out there yet that can do it pressing a button. Unfortunately, I get asked the question every time: is there a software that can speak to our housing management system and our finance system that makes life easy? And sadly, to date, there isn't. So there's a gap in the market. If you're an IT person, there's a gap in the market there. We'd love to speak to you. So they gather all that information, they prepare it, and then they issue the estimates, hopefully end of February, beginning of March. They'll send out the estimates. They also have to, with every single demand, when the estimate or the balancing demand with the final accounts, they have to give you the notice of tenants' rights and obligations. And they allow you to make payment over 12 monthly instalments. They don't have to. They could require you to make payment within the 28 days that's usually obliged under the terms of the lease. They also, at Southampton, and this isn't something that all providers do, unfortunately, they also advise you, if they have and know the estimated costs of any major works, see, I keep on saying this because they're just big repairs, any major works that they're intending to carry out during the year, they try to give you an estimate of those costs at the beginning of the year. But unlike the cost, the revenue cost, the cleaning, the gardening, etc., they don't require and don't demand it at that point in time. They just give you the heads up of what it's like to be, so that you can start either going to your bank to get the money if it's a big amount, or start saving to put the money aside for when they do demand it. Unfortunately, not every provider operates good practice like that. Some providers actually just carry out the Section 20 consultation, and the first thing that the first time that leaseholders know of the estimated cost is on the notice of proposal, which is, you know, just before the work starts. It doesn't give people a lot of time to save up, but Southampton fortunately do. Okay, so that's providing the estimate at the beginning of the year. Then we get to the end of the year, the end of the financial year, which is the 31st of March, and then work begins in crunching the numbers. Okay, so again, they go to the budget holders to get those figures. It's usually a collaboration between budget holders, the finance department, and once they've got all of that information, they use the housing management system to capture that data and convert that data, because it doesn't speak the same language as the home ownership team would like it to speak, in forming those final accounts. So it needs to be converted. And that's where a lot of testing takes place, because that conversion can be a bit of a painful exercise, and I've already mentioned why. Okay, so then it's converted. In the pre-1986 leases, the final count will be sent within 18 months of the year end. 18 months of end of year. Southampton sends within 6 months of the end of the year, i.e. by the end of September. So end of March, end of September, 6 months. And if Southampton have overspent, then they'll send you a balancing demand for the difference. If they've underspent, depending on the sum, they'll take it into account for the following years, or they'll refund the difference. Everything that Southampton do in regards to financial, the accounting timetable and the process they follow is good. It's what we would expect to see if we went into organisations and carried out a service review. You can go, if you don't like if you've got any issues with the service charges. We talked about this last night, going to the tribunal. I would hope that if you have an issue in the first instance with Southampton, that they've got some sort of dispute resolution route. It may well be that they use only their complaints process, their complaints policy, but some organisations do have what we call ADRs in place, alternative dispute resolution options. And even if Southampton didn't have a formal ADR in place, one would hope that before they allowed you, or you know, you went to the tribunal. I shouldn't have used the word allowed, you can just do it. It isn't a question of asking permission. But before they were in a position that you felt that you needed to make an approach to the tribunal, that they got round a table with you, obviously not literally now, and talk to you in a reasonable fashion, a non-confrontational fashion. What is it that doesn't work for you? What is it that you're unhappy with, that you've got concerns with, so that you can have a conversation? Yeah. If after exhausting that conversation you're still unhappy, then you do have the right to go to the first tier tribunal, and you'll find that's contained within the notice of rights and obligations that you are sent with each demand for payment. And you can apply to the tribunal. Actually, Southampton can apply to the tribunal as well for a determination of the reasonableness, and that's what they're looking at, the reasonableness of the charge. So the first thing that the tribunal will look at is your lease, to see if the issue in question, the service that is being disputed, is a service that is an obligation of Southampton's to provide to you. Is it reasonably incurred? The tribunal has the following jurisdiction. That when we're talking, it's got lots of jurisdiction, the tribunal. They deal with all sorts of matters, the right to manage, enfranchisement, lease extensions, a whole host of different things. But for the purposes of talking to you this evening with regards to service charges, their jurisdiction is they can determine who has to pay, who is to receive the payment for the service charge, how much service charge is payable, when it should be made, and how it should be paid. And they can determine that all of those in advance of the demands, or rather in advance of incurring costs. So on estimate, you can make an application to the tribunal because you're not happy with the estimate. You can go based on the estimate. You don't have to wait for the final account and the final spend figures. If you don't like the estimate, you can. Equally, Southampton can go to the tribunal and ask for what's called a predetermination, the same for you, predetermination of whether the estimate is a reasonable amount. So that is something that you can do. I'm going to take your questions on service charge accounting. That's the basic structure of the accounting process for pretty much every social landlord, pretty much every managing agent, private managing agent as well, actually. Okay. I'm going to move on to lease extensions now, and as I say, we've got queries at the end, or question and answer session at the end. So 125-year leases, that's right to buy leases that were created in 1980, and that was when the right to buy was introduced. Some of you in the room may have exercised the right to buy. Some of you will be what we call second generation leaseholders, i.e. you have bought the lease from someone else. It's been assigned, yeah? It's come down to you. When you take the lease on, if you are a second generation leaseholder, you haven't got a lease that started at 120. Some years have gone by since it was created in 1980. Okay, every single year the lease term reduces. If you did buy your lease in 1980, then there are 85 years left to run. Southampton creates what we call coterminous leases. For example, let me show you what that looks like. So we've got a block, let's call it Acacia Court. The first lease in 1980 was created at 125, provided a 125-year lease term. The second time a lease was created through the buy, it was created, let's say in 1985, so 5 years later, that Southampton created or gave a lease term of 120 years. Third lease that may have been created 5 years later in 1990, they created a lease term of 115 years. The reason that a number of providers still do this was because the intention was, before 1993 came in and the right to extend, the intention was that all of the leases would expire at the same time, and then Acacia Court would come back into Southampton's ownership. Leases are a diminishing asset. The lower the term, the less valuable it becomes, okay? In 1993, there was a Housing and Leasehold Reform Act that was introduced, and that gave the statutory right for leaseholders to extend their lease. There have been some changes since the Common Hold and Leasehold Reform Act in 2002. The current position is that for somebody to exercise the statutory right, they must have owned the property for at least 2 years. And in order to buy the 90 years, which is the statutory arrangement at the moment, in order to buy that 90 years, they have to pay Southampton the privilege of extending, because years count in value. It's a diminishing asset. When it gets to nil, the lease is worth nothing. And actually, the property comes back to Southampton with no financial compensation to the former leaseholder, because it's worth nothing. But as I say, that changed in 1993. You do have the statutory right, but you do have to pay for the privilege of buying those extra years. There is a premium attached to buying those extra years. If you buy the extra years through the statutory route, then once you've done so, the ground rent, it's only £10, but it's still nevertheless £10, that actually falls away and becomes a peppercorn rent, which is nothing. Through the statutory route, if you don't like the premium that Southampton attaches to buying those extra 90 years, you can appeal to the FTT. That's one of their jurisdictions. When the number of years on a lease gets to 80 years or less, there is a particular calculation that's carried out that's called the marriage value, and it actually results in a higher value, currently a higher value than had a lease had the lease extension being carried out at 81 years. It's just a higher value because of that marriage value. I'm not going to run through all of that. It's quite complicated. And in order to arrive at any value, there has to be a Royal Institute, a chartered surveyor, valuer to carry out the valuation. They have to be an approved valuer. When the lease term gets to 70 years or less, none of you have got a lease of this nature here, because you've all inherited either second generation or you've purchased, then at 70 years or less, as a leaseholder, it's very difficult to sell, because mortgagees, building societies and banks don't like to lend on a lease term of less than 70 years. So unless you're selling to a cash buyer, then you would be a bit stymied. The website I've given you here, I actually gave it to you last night for a different purpose, but the lease advisory service, there is a leasehold calculator. It's not an exact down to the penny, don't rely on it to the penny, but it does give you an indication, if you know what the lease term is on your lease, it does give you an indication of roughly what it might cost you to extend your lease. This is just the current arrangement for the how to apply if you're thinking of applying. So you would, there are two routes really. You can either serve a Section 42 notice. That's the Section 42 under that Leasehold Reform, Housing and Urban Development Act that I referred to, as amended, stating what you are prepared to pay as a premium for purchasing the 90 years. If you serve that notice, it will immediately, Southampton, the home ownership team will immediately redirect it to the estates and valuation team. But you should know that the landlord, Southampton, has 2 months to respond to your Section 42 notice, and they can accept or deny your offer, that premium that you're offering, but they could offer you a new price and give you reasons why they don't like your price. And then you've got this, there are timescales under the legislation for you to negotiate the price. And as I say, if those 2 month timescales you can't agree, then you go off to the FTT. Or the alternative route, and quite commonly, because many people won't know about the 93 Act, you would probably just write in and say, I'd like to extend my lease, and Southampton will again redirect it to the estates valuation team, and they have those qualified people in the team that will then carry out the valuation and deal with and process your application. However, that's all going to change. So I've told you it as it is at the moment, but there's been a huge, the leasehold system has been criticised for years and years and years. We're quite unique actually in this country. Scotland doesn't have leasehold as a tenure. They have something called factoring. We've had the Common Hold Leasehold Reform Act. Common Hold was supposed to be the panacea for all of the comments, the criticisms levelled at the leasehold tenure. So we're going to have this new thing called Common Hold, where you don't have a landlord, you don't have leaseholders, everybody doesn't have a lease, no diminishing asset, wonderful. No ground rents, no premiums to pay to extend leases, fantastic. But it's not actually evolved, it's not actually been established. We're still living with leasehold. So, but then nevertheless, there's been huge criticism, particularly, I don't know whether you've read in the press over the past year or 2 years, particularly at leasehold houses. And a lot of the new developers are developing schemes with leasehold houses, huge ground rents and huge escalation review periods on the ground rents for these particular houses. So that really has galvanized the great and the good, the government and various other bodies to huddle around the debt. So look, we really need to get to grips with the leasehold tenure, get Common Hold off the ground, how to do this. So they consulted with the whole industry, the private management world, the social housing world, the IRPM that I mentioned earlier, various other bodies and organisations. And as a result of that, earlier this year, this month, or last month rather, as recent as that, there was an announcement about everything to do with the leasehold tenure. But for the purposes of lease extensions and what we're here just to talk about now, one of the things that your ears might prick up is that when lease extensions, applications for lease extensions, potentially, and it's bubbling away and it might come through in legislation any minute, proposed extensions not of 90 years, but of 990 years. Yeah, 990 years. Remember, it's a diminishing asset. So 990 years, suddenly, hey, you're sitting very pretty. No ground rent. Well, there's no ground rent anyway on the existing arrangement, so that's nothing new. But the marriage value, where it's much higher value for the premium when it's 80 years or less, that they want to abolish that altogether. And they also want to have a fairer, more transparent system for calculating the premiums, and also fairly strict menu of fees, admin fees, attached to the whole process. So currently, Southampton can charge an admin fee for running it through the valuations and estates team. Yeah, and that admin fee can be anything that the provider has calculated at reasonable. It can be challenged at the FTT, but still, it varies across providers. And what the legislation is proposing, that it should be a fair and fairly fixed rate for those, for both the premiums and for the admin fees. But it isn't in place now. It's to come, and it might be around the corner, it might be next year, it could be in a couple of years. We just don't know. We've got COVID. We're still battling our way through Brexit. The government is tied up with distractions, so we just don't know how close this is. So what I'm advising you to do is to do your own keeping up to speed. Hopefully Southampton will assist in it on its website as well when anything fresh and new is known. But in order to keep up to date with those changes, keep abreast of those changes and the conversation, and whether it's likely to be next week, next month, next year, is to keep an eye on the lease advisory website, leaseadvice.org. What you don't want to do is to be allowing the lease to whittle down to that 80 years when this isn't in place. And you find that you have to, you may want to sell your property and you can't because it's a lower number of term on your lease. But equally, you don't want to be in a position where you're scared into extending now, when actually this legislation is round the corner, imminent, and you've spent over the odds. So it's your homework, really. As I say, hopefully Southampton will assist, but it really is your homework. So that's the end of the slides. I'm going to take the slides down in a moment. Now, people have been putting messages into the chat, and as I say, I didn't stop because I'm not great with the chat, so I'm going to open up those now, if you don't mind. So, in the first instance now, I'm just going to run through the questions that were submitted. You were all invited to submit any questions that you may have before this evening's session. So a number of questions came in. I split them into the questions that related to the subject matter last night, and we're left with the questions that just relate to the tonight's subject matter. So I'm just going to, first question, there were 6 questions, some with multiple parts. So this is the first one. Why does it take 6 months to issue the actual service charges? Okay, I've covered it slightly, but Southampton have added more to that, because obviously I don't know the complete detail of their processes. So I've given you an overview of what I generally know they do, but what I know that they and other social housing providers do at the end of the financial year. But Southampton have offered this as well. There are 45 services managed by 12 different departments. So there's a lot of work involved in coordinating all of those costs. Also, not all of the costs are received promptly at the end of the year by the suppliers. So for instance, the utility bills are not, you get to the end of the March and the water or the gas or the electricity bill isn't arrived dead on the end of March. You've got to wait for them, particularly if they're being paid quarterly or invoiced quarterly rather. So generally, the work starts at the end of March, but it may not be complete until around July. And then they have this testing process with their housing management system converting the information from their finance system and other sources into a legible format to provide those final accounts, yeah, to individual accounts. So that's why it takes 6 months to actually get through all of that process. Can we have more detail on the biggest costs, e.g. routine repairs, so we can do something about it? So yes, Southampton has said yes, leaseholders can request further information of any of the charges once they've received the final statement in September. That is actually a legal right of yours as well. Further question. I'm not quite sure I understand this, but I think Southampton have made a guesstimate about this question. Estimate service charges, that has been double. Last year from April, also backdated arrears. So I think they've interpreted that as the estimate for the service charges have doubled. Okay, and their response is the estimated service charges are based on the actual cost of providing services for each block, which they should be. When we were calculating the service charges at the beginning of 2020, we found that some charges had not been reviewed for some time, and as a result, were not covering some essential services. Unfortunately, the council are not in a position to continue to subsidise shortfalls, so some leaseholders did see a large increase in their estimated service charges last year. We will be continuing to review all costs going forward to ensure that large increases like this do not happen in the future. These charges are estimated at this time, and we will not know the actual cost of services until the end of the financial year, which is usual. Further question, is there any provision if I wish to buy the freehold of the flat, and how much would it cost, or the lease extension costs? So you can't buy the freehold of a flat, but you can extend the years on your lease, which is what I've just covered. The cost of extending your lease is dependent on the number of years remaining, which again, I think I've covered. The shorter the number of years, the greater the costs. And currently, by law, through the statutory route, the extension would be a further 90 years. In addition to the cost of extending the lease, that's the premium, leaseholders are also liable to pay the council's legal and surveyor's costs. And currently, these costs are £900 legal and £400 for the valuation. The valuation and estates team's costs. Leaseholders are within their rights to employ their own surveyor and solicitor if they feel that this is appropriate. By the way, if you do employ your own surveyor, this surveyor does have to be an RICS qualified surveyor, Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors valuation. Otherwise, Southampton are not obliged to take their that valuation, but you can engage your own solicitor. It is possible to purchase the freehold of a leasehold house. Leaseholders will also be required to pay the council's reasonable costs in addition to the cost of purchasing the freehold, and the legal and surveyor's costs of £400 and £350 respectively. When do you start the process of lease extension and gathering cost information? So the process starts when we've received a financial undertaking to do the valuation, and usually this is a non-refundable deposit of £250. Further question on lease extensions. Am I able to extend the lease on my garage located in Round Hill Close? What are the procedures for doing this? The garage leases are currently being discussed with legal services. Residents who've raised an inquiry through the Estates and Valuations team will be advised once further information is available. And then there was a further question which could have formed part of last night, but we've got it here. Major works, how does Southampton select the contractors? That's a question that at the moment is out. I don't know whether, Rosemary, you want to come in on that, because At the time that I received these questions, there was no response from the Section 20 team, the asset team.
Yes, if you bear with me a minute, I just need to find the response. I am sorry, I should have picked that up already. I will find that and I'll come back to you in a few minutes.
Okay, lovely. And then there was a final question that came in, but it wasn't a question. It was really just 3 words. It was estimate, statement, detail. So maybe that can come through when we open the floor now to the questions. So they were the questions that were previously submitted. So now the floor's open to you guys, and we've got a couple of hands up already. So if I can go to ladies first, Lisa, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. On our service charges, we get charged a insurance, a building insurance in it as well.
Yeah.
Why isn't our building insurance covering the roof repairs?
Roof repair, if it's a genuine repair, insurance is not for repairs. It's for usually for something accidental damage. I don't know your policy, maybe Rosemary can cut in here, but generally speaking, insurance doesn't cover anywhere, any organisation, just basic repairs.
Right, okay. So obviously I missed out on the roof repair last night's session. Sorry, what was that? For the major repairs on the roof. Can I just ask the question, because obviously I have to leave the room in a minute. How long have we got to actually pay for that to be done?
Is Rosemary there?
Yes, sorry, I'm having some issues with my Zoom at the moment. That would need to be discussed with the customer payment team. But once you've got received an invoice, if you give them a call or send them an email, they'll be able to discuss that with you. If you can't, obviously, if you cannot pay for it up front, there are other options and they'd be able to discuss that in full with you.
Okay, thank you. But it's definitely going to be about £6.5 grand, is it?
That's the estimated cost, and that's going to be based on the surveys that have taken place. But obviously, we won't know the true cost until work's been done. But I know the practice is to put a small amount on top, just a contingency to make sure that we keep within those costs. So there's normally a small contingency on top, just in case there's anything untowards they find. So if they, for instance, took the roof off and they found that there was more work to be done, there's that contingency fund there just in case. Right,
okay, lovely. Thank you very much for your help.
Okay, just before I come to you, Will and Peter, just a point there that Southampton allow you to pay those major works costs, those big repair costs, over a period of time. Sometimes it can be years, depends on the size of the bill, yeah, and the circumstances. Sadly, that they do that out of, I say out of the goodness of their heart, because it really is. But if private managing agents, not at all. If the lease says you have to pay it within, in fact, managing agents don't pick up a paintbrush unless they've got the money in the bank beforehand. So, you know, they won't do any work unless you forward fund, simply because they're not, it is not their money. Yeah, it's not their money. They're dealing with somebody else, a landlord's money, a freeholder's money, and that's why they won't do anything unless they've got the money in front. Fortunately, Southampton have got, you know, the facility and the flexibility to allow you to pay over, but they don't have to. They could say, sorry, no, the lease says pay in 28 days, so we'd like that £6 grand in 28 days. I just thought I'd say that. They won't, so you don't need to worry, they won't do that, but I need to just put it out there.
Right, I've unmuted. Yeah, how do I check the charges? Because we are noticed, and I think another lady mentioned it last night as well, that some of the charges that we're getting are absolutely disproportionate to the work that's being done. And how do I actually check on this? I actually got, I put a lot of questions up before Christmas, and I got some answers, unfortunately, that I daren't say that were untruthful, but put it this way, they didn't bear any correlation to the questions that I asked. Things like, you know, the cleaning and how many times were they doing the cleaning. But of course, I took a photograph of the sheet that the cleaners were there, and I was sent, these are the times that you are being charged for the cleaning. And of course, they weren't, they didn't correspond. So what I wanted to do was check, and also the amounts we're being charged. And I was told about the grass cutting that, well, it wasn't just our block, it was the whole of Southampton, and we were just given a division of it. And I said, but that's not in our lease. I said, it's the time spent cutting the grass at our place. And then they said, oh, it's because they do all your rose beds and all your things. I said, but we haven't got any. We haven't got any flower beds. We haven't got anything like that. We've got two men who come round, one on a machine, one on a strimmer, and they come about 8 times a year, and we get charged an absolutely extortionate amount. Each time they're here, they're about 40 minutes, possibly an hour, and we get about £1,700 bill. So, you know, I want to be able to check that that bill that is coming in is a genuine bill from this contractor, and that we're being divided up, and that it's not just the leaseholders that are paying this, because we can't think that somebody is charging such extortionate rates to the council, and the council is agreeing to pay these very, very high rates. So all I'm asking is, how can I check on these things? Because the information I'm getting back at the moment is just, well, unbelievable.
Okay, I'm not sure actually if it's in the tenant's rights and obligations. I suspect it is actually hidden in there, but if it isn't in there, there is something called a section 22 request, section 18 to 30, it's section 22. It is a request that can be made for further supporting information as to how those summary figures have been arrived at, which is what you're saying. However, you must be aware that if you make that section 22 request, the law is a bit of an ass, to be honest, Peter, but you can make that section 22 request in writing. It has to be in writing about what information you want. But Southampton can charge you to provide that information. If they send you out information, they can actually charge you to supply it. They can invite you in for you to take copies of the, obviously when we're out of COVID, to take copies of the supporting information. Again, they can charge you for those copies. And equally, they can charge you for the time they take to facilitate.
This was the things that I had back from them previously, from the leaseholders meeting. And honestly, it's like the fact that, oh, if you complain, we're going to charge you money. And so yeah, it was almost like a blackmail thing against people. I was trying to represent some of the leaseholders, people who can't afford things. And it was been saying, oh yeah, but you have to pay this and you have to pay that. And it said, also, if you went to tribunal, it might cost you, and the words used to me personally were, it might cost you £60,000 to go. Because if you're taking this up, you would have to pay all our legal costs and everything if you lost. And it was like to say, well, if you're going to complain about anything we charge you, whether it's right or wrong, doesn't really matter, but we'll charge you. And I felt very hurt by that, honestly.
Yeah, no, I can understand that you would. There is that chance. I mean, that is the facility, that is those are the regulations. I was just going to go on to say about the law being a bit of an ass, because if you did make the request under a section 22, and I'm talking about all these costs, etc., if you were still not satisfied, or even if you didn't make that section 22 request, or you made the request and Southampton said, sorry, I'm not going to give you that, give you that information. The reason I say the law is an ass is because you can still then go to the section 22 is a request for information that you've got to make within, I can't remember the number of days of receiving the final account. Sorry, my mind's gone a blank, it's a bit late. So many days, but even if you went beyond that days, I think it's 6 months actually, even if you went beyond that time period, that doesn't mean your chance is gone, because you could still go to the tribunal and get exactly the same information provided. So that's why I was saying it's a little bit of a bit of an ass. But yes, you could go to a tribunal, and it would depend on the panel. Of course, you can make an application, it's called a Section 20C application at the tribunal, which is basically asking the panel to limit or do away with any costs being passed on to you. Now, it's a bit of a risk. If they see that you're just going there to be awkward, which clearly you're not, but if they think that you are, then even though you've made that 20C application, preventing Southampton from passing on the costs, they might decide that Southampton can pass on the costs, because Southampton are likely to go along and say, we would like our costs. But as I said yesterday, and as I've said at the beginning of today, when I was talking about service charges, nobody wants to end up in the tribunal. They want to satisfy you. Hopefully, Southampton want to satisfy you that their approach is transparent and that you completely fully understand how they've arrived at those figures, where they've come from. They don't want you to be unhappy and to be spreading the unhappiness word to all of your neighbours and any other leaseholder that will listen to you.
Trying to get it to speak. Trying to talk to.
I hear exactly what you're saying, and I don't have a problem with individuals or whatever. What I just worry about is that if I get a bill at my house, you know, I will pay that bill because I know what it's for. But when I get a bill and I don't know, you know, how they've calculated this bill, and then they send me a spreadsheet that shows me, when I interrogate the spreadsheet and go into the figures, and it shows that they started with the answer calculated back and said this was the bill. And I think to myself, well, you know, what's going on? I don't understand.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from, but and that's, yeah, I can see. But the fact that they've sent you might not be ideal, and maybe you can get together and say, well, actually, can you just interpret this a little bit better and crunch it down a bit? The fact that they've actually given you that information alone suggests to me, and sends out a message to me, they've got nothing to hide.
No, I'm not saying they have, but I'm just saying that I want to pay a bill that I know what it's for.
Yeah, and you want to see the audit trail, and you want to see the audit trail back. And I think there's probably potential there for you both to get together and say, right, you've given me all this information, but can you just make it a bit easier to see how you got from A to B?
Because if I go into the history on all the previous years up until about 2 years ago, the leasehold department used to give us information, explain everything to us, and that was fine. You know, and it all sort of changed a couple of years ago, and the bills started going up and up and up, like you've just explained to us the reason why, because they said they were recalculating new things, but we couldn't just understand how the calculations got to what they were going to. So that was it. Well, that was all.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think there is ground that can be made up if you explain what you had before and you were satisfied with it. You might not like things going up, but at least you could recognize where they came from and get to a position with in the current regime structure information that you're getting. I think there's ground there that could be made up, and you would move forward in a more content position than you are now.
Yeah, and I'll just say I was speaking on behalf of really like the Leaseholder Forum,
Sure.
who those got together and said, will you represent us and do this? And that's why I actually
Yeah.
started doing that, as the tenant engagement team do actually know. I did that
Yeah, no,
on
I
their
get
behalf.
that.
Yeah.
And that's why it's worth Southampton listening to that, because they know you're a spokesperson and your voice will go to a lot of people.
Yeah.
I'm going to end that one because we've got a few more people. We've got
Yes, of course.
Paula. Thanks, Peter. What is the general professional opinion on the cost of lease renewal when and if the new legislation comes into effect? I.e., will it be more or less expensive to renew than under the current legislation? I really don't know. I can't answer that one. The whole purpose of the new legislation coming into play is to be much more certain about admin costs and premiums. At the moment, it's and certainly with the marriage value, nobody has got a clear handle on what it is likely to mean for them in their back pocket. So that's the purpose of the legislation, to have a kind of pretty even keel and everybody to know. But whether it will go up or down, given that the proposed lease extension is now going to go from 90 to 990, and given that landlords, they make a lot of money, don't they? Every time there's a lease extension, they're making money, premiums. I don't know whether any of you saw the Panorama programme. It was a number of, might have been months ago. Don't we lose time at the moment with COVID? But there was a Panorama programme on, and it was basically, you may have seen it and you thought, oh, that's all to do with shared ownership. But actually it wasn't. It was focusing quite heavily at one point in the programme on the value that the leasehold tenure means to landlords, freeholders. Because every time the lease diminishes and you want to extend it, it's money in the landlord's back pocket for doing nothing other than owning the land on which your flat sits. So if the proposal is to extend the lease to 990 years, think about it. It's going to be a long, long time before landlords get any money. Yeah, so they don't like it. Landlords, freeholders don't like it, this proposal. So what that might mean to be an appetite, appease them, it might mean that the valuation in order to create that 990 is a lot more, because it's going to be a long time before landlords get their hands on any more money. So, hey guys, we'll give you a lot more now, this one-off lease extension, because you won't be around in 990 years. Then it might well mean that it's more. I don't know. I really don't know. I can't assist you there. I really think it is one for you to watch yourself. Go on to the lease advisory website and see. I don't know, Rosemary, whether you've got your ear to the ground on typical premiums attached to lease extensions or not. Do you know what's going through the books?
No, unfortunately not. No, all I would suggest, as you say, use the leasehold calculator. It is really, it's as long as you know the rough value of the property. I mean, you can get that from like Zoopla or websites like that, and you know how many years there are left on your lease. It is it's fairly close. I would say it's quite accurate if you want to know how much the actual extension cost is going to be.
Oh, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. Let me just see what other questions we've got. Tracy, you had a question.
Yes,
like
I did. Hi, thank you. So I'm the lady Peter was referring to, asking the question last night. You mentioned something in the estate charges, I think they were called, that like lawns and that lot are not paid by leaseholders. Is that correct?
How to get into it.
I was under the impression that you didn't have any estate charges, but you clearly do. That might be my mistake. I apologise.
So within our charges last year, we were told that we had to pay for the mowing of a patch of grass outside that 36 other flats overlook and the whole estate can access. does that sound like an estate charge, or am I misinterpreting that? Sorry.
No, don't worry about that. There is, right, okay. So when you've got a block of flats, you've usually got some what we call reserved property around the block of flats, and that might be just a little bit of grass, it might be a bin shed, it might be a drying area, it might be a few car parking spaces, and they only really are used by the people in that block of flats. If you look at your lease, then there should be a line drawn round the block of flats, but encompassing those bits that I've already mentioned, yeah? And what the service charge, this is usually the construction, is that only the people in that block pick up the costs associated with mowing the bit of grass, maintaining the bin store, maintaining the rotary dryer if there is that, and it is only those people. So you wouldn't be, unless you have got a lease that's drawn around the whole of the estate, that would be a different cost. So you get an equal split of those block costs, including that drying area and bit of grass, and you may well be picking up, because I may have made a mistake, that you do pick up estate costs, in which case if there are 300 people on the estate, you'd pick up 1/300th of the estate costs, and that would be the general lawns and grounds that are not attached to a particular block. So that
Okay, so it's not attached to a particular block, it's a patch of land in between the blocks that anybody can walk on, walk their dogs on, kids, anybody can access it, but we're being charged to maintain it.
right. Do you know for sure that nobody else is being charged to maintain that?
No, all the leaseholders are being charged
Right, okay.
in those particular flats.
And you know that it is only the leaseholders?
Well, I don't know. Rosemary was saying that the council tenants would be paying somehow or other in their rent, but it only came into effect last year.
Right, okay. So this sounds like it's one of those charges that has never been charged at all, and now they're doing the work, they weren't paying for it, and so it's been introduced. So you've had the benefit of not paying for it previously, but it's now been introduced. Tenants, because we were talking about this last night,
Yep.
may have some what we call pooled service charges, i.e. they are incorporated in the rent. So if they were to talk to you, you know, if you talk to the tenants, they'll say, well, I've just got my bill, it doesn't mention anything about that grounds maintenance. That's because it's hidden in the rent. That doesn't mean you're only paying it. Okay. Everybody's paying it equally, but yours is visible because you don't pay a rent. Okay,
so I did have a nice suggestion. You know that you mentioned that we have the estimated cost comes out like March, I think you said, or something, and then 6 months later we have another, the proper charges. Now normally that's quite a lot of money difference, and we have to pay that within 28 days. Is there any way that the council could, on the estimated charges, add another 10% and list it as an additional, shall we say, credit, so that when the real charges come out, if we're having to pay £100, because we've already paid 10% extra on top, we're not having to find as much, almost like a savings?
Yeah, yeah, that sounds fine for you, but it may not be fine for everybody, and that extra 10% is unenforceable because it's not contained within the terms of the lease, and everybody would be able to necessarily manage it as you might be able to.
I think it might be a bit easier to manage monthly rather than pay within 28 days.
Yeah, no, I can see where you're coming from, but if people are having difficulties in the same way as they receive these major repairs, 6,000, a few thousand bills, Southampton could equally say you've got to pay that in 28 days, but doesn't. They are receptive and do listen to people who are in difficulty. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing that.
Okay, all right, thank you.
All right, thank you. Andrew, you're waving at me. So that means, that suggests to me you want to ask a question, but you need to unmute, otherwise I won't be able to hear you.
I'm only
Yeah,
waving to say
right.
goodbye.
Oh, well,
But
yeah. Okay,
going
all
back to
right.
your the last person there, I don't think we pay 10% more because this year we had a rebate, so they will put it right if they made it wrong. So bear that in mind, everyone. Okay, take care. Thanks for everything.
Thank you for that comment, Andrew. Thank you very much. Thank
Okay,
you.
good luck, everyone. Bye.
Oh,
Let's see what else we've got on the chat. Don't think. What happens if I've got my lease extended by 90? Oh, you want to, what happens if you want to extend your lease before the law changes? Will my lease automatically extend to 990 years? No, it won't.
yeah, doing it.
Before the legislation comes in, it will only extend by 90 years. That's the statutory regulations now, the statutory route now. If you do it now, it will only give you an extra 90 years. Okay.
Sorry, Jackie, I think Paul Napier wanted to ask a question. I've been waiting. Not sure if you can see him.
I did ask him and he did speak to me, Paul, speak to me.
I'm trying to. Can you hear me?
I can now, yes.
Good. Thank you. I've recently bought a flat and given it to my, rented it to my granddaughter. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, I'm the landlord.
Yeah.
Now I still need to extend the leasehold on it. How do I go about that? Who do I get in touch with?
Right, okay, we did cover that on one of the slides. There are two routes. You can either just write in to the home ownership team and say, I'd like to extend my lease, and they will redirect it through to the estates and valuation team, and they'll start the process off with you. Yeah, so they'll contact you, they'll want the deposit of 250 quid to carry out the valuation, and they'll start the process with you. Okay, if you,
what's it likely to cost?
well, I covered that as well.
50 years.
Yeah, I covered that as well. You need to, Rosemary can't give you a figure for that, but she did just explain that if you go onto the website that I've given, that you will find on the slides when you're sent them, it's the leaseadvice.org website. It has got a lease extension calculator there, and according to Rosemary, it's fairly accurate. So you'll need to know roughly the value of your property. If you don't know the value of the property, she suggests you use Zoopla, something like that, to see what's been sold in your block in the area recently, and then go back to the lease extension calculator. And I'd say Rosemary believes it's fairly accurate.
Okay, fairly accurate.
Okay.
Okay, and once I've decided that, I then just go ahead and pay the money.
Yeah, contact Rosemary and she'll redirect you over to the estates and valuation, and they'll ask you for your money because they want the money up front.
But the final question is, I need a ballpark figure before I start making inquiries.
No, you don't. I mean, you don't need to have a ballpark figure, but my suggestion would be to get that ballpark figure, because you don't want to find after you've paid your 250 quid that is such a valuation that you think, no, I'm not going to proceed with this. So I would just do your homework, and once you're satisfied that, yeah, this is for me, then I would start the ball rolling.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is I've got a ballpark figure because I paid the price, this lease, and it's less than 2 years, actually, my wife was telling me. So it's just coming up to 2 years, right? So that would give me some idea. Somebody should be able to give me some idea of what an approximate would be on that.
Southampton won't give you that. The lease extension calculator on the website that I'm going to give you will give you that. Southampton won't.
Okay, and I'll just I'll just follow the instructions on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Okay. We've got a lady called administrator. sorry, Darren, I'll come back to you. I've just noticed you in my side of my eye.
When I applied for an extension on my lease, or looking into it a while ago, I had a letter back to say that only 2 other flats apart from my own in the block are leasehold. They're all council tenants. So I won't be able to apply for it unless there's a percentage. I can't remember what the percentage was. I don't know if it was 50%. So I wouldn't be allowed to apply to extend the lease. Do you think that may change with the new changes coming in?
I think there's confusion there. That they're talking about enfranchisement, leasehold enfranchisement, i.e. somewhere in your communication, you've probably suggested that you want to buy the freehold.
Oh, right. Okay, maybe it was that then. I've got confused. It was a little while ago, yeah.
Yeah, it's about the freehold, and yeah, if there are only, depending on how many people are in the block, how many are long leaseholders like yourself, there's certain criteria that you've got to satisfy. But that's what you've asked. You've asked about leasehold enfranchisement.
So
that's buying freehold.
So to extend the lease, I should be able to do that.
Oh, absolutely. You've got the statutory right. Yeah.
But what you're suggesting is to hang on a little bit and wait to see what the changes are before we pay out, and then it might change.
I can't suggest, I can't advise you. I'm just saying you need to keep an eye and do your homework.
Yeah.
I'm talking to a lot of landlords at the moment about this very issue, and I say you're caught between a rock and a hard place, really.
Yeah.
You can't leaseholders to say, by the way, start extending now because you're getting to that 80-year threshold and marriage value when the premium rocket. Not rocket, but go up much more. And you can't equally say, hold out for the legislation, because you just don't know what that's going to be. So unfortunately, Southampton and the like are, as I say, caught between a rock and a hard place.
Oh, okay.
I'm an independent. I can tell you what the changes afoot are, but I can't advise you what to do.
Right, okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for your help. Yeah.
No problem. Darren, you had a question.
Yes, I do. When I bought the flat, the previous owners extended the lease, but they weren't able to extend the lease on the garage. Okay.
Right.
I owned the property after 2 years. I applied to the council to extend the lease on the garage because it had a short lease on it, less than 50 years.
Yeah.
And after 2 years, the council wouldn't allow me to do that because it was on a development plan, and the council were going to do compulsory purchase on the garages. That development plan didn't come off, and it's now not on a development plan. But when I applied to extend the lease on the garage, which is now sub 40 years on the garage, I've been informed I'm not allowed to do it.
Right, because this came up as one of the questions. Lease extensions on a garage. Are you in Round Hill Close?
The garage is in Round Hill Close. Yeah, this is the one, and we've got a neighbour who's trying to sell their property at the moment, and they've had to take a £10,000 hit on the property price because the garage, because it's been as part of a mortgage, they're saying obviously it's a short lease on the garage. He's tried to sell the garage separately because it is on a separate lease, but even though the council were allowed to buy the garage independent of the flat, we're not allowed to sell the garage independently if we sell the properties ourselves.
Yeah, it sounds like a legal nightmare, the way that arrangement has been entered into. To be honest, but I know that the response from Southampton when this question was previously submitted, that you're waiting for advice from the from the legal department.
Yeah.
On the way forward, because it just sounds.
The problem you've got is that the council believe there's 8 garages there, and there's actually 16, but the council own 8 of them. The other 8 are privately owned, and we had several heated conversations and photographs saying no, there's 16, and we actually sent photographs of 16 garages. They then realised there were 16 garages, they weren't going to do the compulsory purchase, but consequently we aren't in a position to be able to sell our properties at the moment because they won't allow us to sell the garage independently. So it's a bit of an issue at the present moment, and it's not really being resolved.
Yeah. Well, it's only, no, it isn't resolved, but I gather from Rosemary that the matter is with the legal services. I mean, who the hell created such a complicated arrangement, probably because they did envisage perhaps redevelopment potential in the future. That's possibly why.
They did put plans on. We actually saw the plans of the properties that were going to be built there. But that then got dropped.
Yeah, I think it's trying to get themselves out of, you know, how can they resolve this situation to everybody's satisfaction, yours mainly. Yeah, particularly if the other 8 are privately owned.
Well, this is the problem. The council weren't aware of it. They always thought there's only 80 garages there, which they owned. They didn't realise the other 8 were privately owned, and that was that was one of the big issues. They didn't realise the amount.
Yeah. Well, they were probably looking at their title and what was covered under their title, and their title ownership would only show the 8 garages that they owned and not the 8 that had been sold off. So all I can say to you, Darren, is the council have got hold of the problem. They're looking at the problem and they're looking at how to deal with the problem. Don't think it's going to be an overnight fix, that one, though. It's
not, and has been a while as well. And just an extension of that, going back to buildings insurance, I find it a bit bizarre that the block we're in hasn't got a block policy. It's paid under our service charge. We've had to do individual insurances, which to me is a problem. It's a disaster waiting to happen, because you know as well as I do, somebody's floor is somebody else's ceiling. And when you've got 2 insurance companies involved, they're going to go into dispute, which you put 0 value on the property as well. So I'm just wondering why we've never had a block policy for the entire block.
Pass on that one, because it is usual to have a block policy.
Oh, absolutely.
Most providers will have a block policy. Yeah, absolutely.
There isn't a block policy, and there's 6 of us in this block, and each and every one of us have to have our own building insurance, which is bonkers, because each of us are paying our own building insurance. And as I say, we haven't had to make a claim yet, but as soon as we do have to make a claim for whatever, it's going to be an absolute nightmare, because the 2 companies were so nothing to do with us.
Right, because insurance cropped up last night actually with Ocasso. Rosemary, do you want to comment on that? Because I understood that Ocasso was your building insurer.
They are, unfortunately, with Middleton Close. These are 2 blocks of flats which the council acquired some years ago, and the leases came with those blocks of flats. So the leases were already kind of in place when we took these properties over. So that is a holdover from these old leases. And so it is just those 2 blocks as well. It is something we are trying to manage with our legal team, and there's a lot of legal issues around those 2 blocks of flats at the moment, which we're trying to sort out. But I would really apologise for the amount of time it's taking to sort it out at the moment.
Right, so you've got 2 blocks of flats which Southampton are the freeholder of now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you've inherited the old leases, and the leases are the leases are drafted in such a way that the insurance, that each individual leaseholder arranges their own insurance for their, can't you just do a lease variation section?
Yes, we would like to do that, and that's something we are going to be putting into our legal team, but there's a lot of other, as you can see, there's lots of other issues with these properties, and now with the garages as well.
And to add on that as well, we've just had last week the door entry system, because we haven't got a door entry system. The guys came around last week to start installing the door entry system. They put all the electrical work in and everything like that, just to realise that we weren't council tenants here. And they came back 3 days later and took out everything they put in.
Oh,
we're not doing a door entry system now either, which they were saying was part of the Grenfell fallout. If there's an open space, there's fire departments come from, actually, to say that it should be enclosed at the front and back. But they've now taken all of their work out and obviously left the holes and everything like that as well. And again, that's another issue we've had over the last 2 weeks.
I will pick that up with our fire safety team, because that was a miscommunication between the fire safety team and AST, who are our contractors. And I will make them aware that they've actually made holes in the block as well, and get them to sort it out, because I wasn't aware they'd got to that point. That's something we were, we have been made aware of, that they'd appeared on site when they shouldn't have been, and we did make the fire safety team aware, so we will put this back to them again and say they've also made some damage to the block which they're going to need to go back and sort out.
Sounds like quite a mess, really, with Middleton Close.
It could be worse. I own a property down Oceana Boulevard, and that's even worse. So don't even go down that area.
Oh dear. Okay, so we've also got questions from Will, but unfortunately your mic isn't working. So he's got loads of questions. Let's see what he's saying here. I recently went to a stage 2. I'm assuming that's a complaint. I was told that our geothermal bill was 2 years behind, and yet Rosemary handed me a current bill to prove what we should pay, and yet mysteriously it was £300 less in the end. Also, why are fire doors costing £2,500 when the materials cost around £300? Same doors. Also, we do pay a charge on estates for gardening if anyone wants to contact me, and Will has provided to everyone his. Rosemary's actually shortly to I think yeah, that's oh, hang on a minute. Yeah, Will's points. So there are no more hands up, and we did say that once we'd exhausted the questions that Rosemary, we're going to invite Rosemary to comment on some of the comments that were made and observations last night. But perhaps, Rosemary, you can respond to Will's chat.
Yeah, the geothermal heating system, it's quite an unusual heating system. It connects both the heating and the hot water, and it all feeds one estate. It's like geothermal, which is ground heat source heat, basically. The way we're billed is we're billed for the geothermal. We get a quarterly bill, and obviously, as with all actuals, leaseholders get the bills at the end of the financial year, and they get the actuals in September. The difference of geothermal, as opposed to every other kind of heating system, is that the contract we have says that if the gas costs are lower, so domestic gas cost is lower, then we get a rebate on that difference. But that rebate is always 2 years in arrears, and we're not always going to be guaranteed a rebate. So the geothermal costs will differ each year depending on whether we have a rebate or not. So there is quite a high cost, but it is for heating and hot water. So not just heating, so it's an all-round system, and it can be used all year round as well. But you might find some years you get a lower bill because we've had a rebate, and other years you'll just get the full cost because we haven't had any money back. With regards to the fire doors, we can give more information on the actual cost of the doors. They are quite expensive because they are a very specific type of door that is fire safe, and we've been told that this is the standard we have to have in our blocks now. Obviously on the back of Grenfell and things like that. They do cost quite a lot to manufacture, and they also cost quite a bit to fit. But if anyone wanted advice or a breakdown of those costs and how they've come about, obviously they can come to us and we can ask our fire safety team to provide that. I think that's kind of answered everything. We've already gone over the grounds maintenance charges, so I'll leave that one for the minute. Earlier on, we were saying, we're talking about the tender process and how the Section 20 works. I have now got the quote from our Section 20 team, so I can run through that. And that was in answer to questions from yesterday as well. So the tenders process is undertaken in accordance with the Public Contract Regulations 2015. And this is where competitive quotes are obtained against a specific tender document. And in a tender process which is open to all contractors across the UK and Europe. So obviously this is in very large major works where the cost is over a certain amount, where we have to used to put it in the European Journal. Obviously now Brexit's happened, so it's slightly different. There are no restrictions other than the minimum standards such as insurance cover and quality standards that we request from any contractor which we appoint. So there are a number of different professionally qualified, competent persons who scrutinise these tender returns when we get them back. And each cost is reviewed by a quantity surveyor, and the quality is assured by a panel of at least 3 officers. And in the occasion with the roofs, this comprise the project manager, the lead consultant, and then his line manager as well. The process is overseen by the procurement lead, with all Southampton City Council officers working together to ensure that we've got best value for our leaseholders, and obviously for the council as well, because we want to make sure we've got best value for money. So that kind of covers the query we had yesterday about the tender process and how we get the best the quotes and how it all works. And there was also some queries about the Section 20 letters as well, and the format that we use. We have been obviously taking on board all of the feedback we get when it comes to all of the information that we pass out to leaseholders, and we are always trying our best to change the way things look, and to change the information that we're providing so people can understand it, but also within keeping with the Section 20 laws and what we have to keep in the letters legally. I understand that the balcony letters, which were sent out quite a few years ago, were extremely complicated. I looked through them myself, and I found it hard to understand all of the information that was there. And I think that the way that the costs were set out was quite difficult to understand. So I completely agree that we should have improved on that. I think we have been doing in some of the other letters that we've been sending out. We've been making sure that the estimated costs are very clear, that they are within the first page of the letter that's gone out. However, again, with the roof contract, because it was such a complicated contract, and the way we were doing it as a framework, which means we had lots of contractors rather than one single contractor. Again, I think the amount of information we're giving to leaseholders could have probably been scaled back, and we put more information on our website and put more focus on the actual cost to the leaseholder in the letters. So obviously we have taken the feedback that we've received on board, and we will be looking to change again the format of the letters we're sending out to make sure that we're covering everything that people want to know, but also keeping within the guidelines as well. So I think that answers everything that I wanted to answer tonight.
We've got a question from Ali. Ali, do you want to go?
Yeah, actually, yeah. Hi, Jackie. Actually, just I want
Hi
to
there.
know there is limited to lease extending. Like let's say minimum year, like 4 years or 5 years. Have you got the minimum year?
No, it's under the statutory route, it's 90, and actually as a leaseholder you wouldn't want it to be less, because if it was less and then it diminishes and then you've got to reapply to extend it again, each time you do that you're incurring valuation fees and legal fees. So actually it's in your interest to get a longer extension, because then you're only doing it once. I do appreciate that obviously currently there's value in that, those years. So that's where you're coming from, aren't you? Thinking, oh, well, I'll pay less and just get another 10 years or something like that. No, the statutory route is 90 automatically.
Because there's someone, early on, they asked about the, to extend the garage. He said you couldn't.
Yeah, well, that's it. That's a different issue altogether, and that's being looked at by the legal department. It's not a residential leasehold extension. It's a garage lease, and that might follow different rules. I'm not sure. I've never come across leases on garages, I'll be honest. So it's outside of my province.
Okay, that means there's no minimum or lease extending, you know,
No.
and it can do it, you know, like let's say our flat, you know, nearly about run out about 2 years time, yeah. Still, you can extend it, isn't it?
Sorry, I didn't understand that.
Yeah, I said, you know, for example, our flat, you know, let's say, you know, about 2 years time, you know, renew it, you know, you got to do it, renew it or extending it. Still, we can't do any, or, you know, I mean, there's no limited here.
You've got to have owned your property for 2 years under the statutory route, and currently with the current regulations, you have to have owned the property for 2 years. If you go through the statutory route, it's an automatic 90 years, no movement on that. Some organisations have introduced a voluntary, their own policy route, and then they don't have to follow. Many of them do follow are consistent with the statutory route, but through a voluntary route, you don't have to. But not every organisation has introduced their own voluntary lease extension policy. So unless Southampton went down that route, currently, the only option you've got is the statutory route.
Okay, thanks so much. Thank you very much.
Okay, we've had a question from Stephen about flat front doors that lead to open communal areas with 2 escape routes. Do they need to be replaced with new fire doors? I'll be honest, Stephen, I'm not a fire risk assessment expert. Compliance is not my strength, I'll be honest with you. So I can't advise you on that. But Rosemary, perhaps you could take that one away and get back to Stephen at some point.
Yes, I believe they probably do, but I will go back to our fire safety team just to get confirmation, and I can come back to you directly if you want.
I know closed areas are very much tighter on the you know, fire risk and fire doors and intermittent strips and all the rest of it. But when it's an open communal area, I just don't know. I'm sorry. Darren, did you have another question?
Yes, it's just going back to your slides. You said obviously as a leaseholder, if you didn't like anything, you could go to a first-tier tribunal.
Yeah.
Just to let people aware they're on this Zoom call today, I actually done that with another management company because I didn't agree with the service charges over 3 years. There was entries in there which were wrong, and we literally paid over the odds for 3 years worth. So I brought a FTT with them. We went to court. The court awarded in my favour, of which case I then obviously went to that management company to recover my costs, of which case the first-tier tribunal then turned around and said, oh, actually, we can't enforce this. We can only ask them to do it. And as to date, they still have not refunded any of the service charge that was awarded to me. I had to pay for the courts and bring in the tribunal. So even though it favored my favour, it only came to me, wasn't for the rest of the block either. It was only that I was awarded to it. So even with the management company, and it's a block of, it's down at Asiana Boulevard actually. So it's the 300 odd flats down there. Wasn't actually applied to everybody, it's just me. And consequently, I've now been footed with the bill. So just be careful if you are talking about the first-tier tribunal. It's not enforceable. The only thing they can do is ask them to pay it if they would like to, please.
Yeah, and managing agents, they don't have their own money.
No.
So that's that's a problem. Yeah, they don't have their own money. Oh dear, that not satisfactory, Darren. That would not be the case with Southampton though, because they would have reputational damage. They've got, you know,
MPs. And just to reinforce your point as well, I know a couple of people were saying today about costs involved in forward funding. Again, I'll bring back personal experience on here. I have been hit with a forward funding bill, and it has been hit on a service charge, which is the beginning of January. And just to let you know, we have been hit with anything from £12,000 up to £55,000, and depends on your flat. 12,000 was for a studio flat, 55,000 was for a 2-bed. that is hitting our service charge as from January. 28 days to pay. Thanks very much. So
yeah, and that's, yeah, I mean, you know, for all the criticisms that are levelled, and it's not just Southampton, it's every social landlord gets criticised to hell and back about, you know, their leasehold management. But you do have the luxury of this, none of this forward funding. You do have the luxury, if you've got difficulties, that Southampton will listen to those difficulties and will do something about it.
yeah, and that's the thing about Southampton, where I say this other management company I'm dealing with at the present moment don't quite see it that way.
No, they don't. They don't. I, as I say, I do work with the Institute of Residential Property Managers, which is all managing agents. And yeah, so I know how they work and operate. I mean, they don't, yeah, it's because it's not their money. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I know that you've got your glass of wine to look forward to now, and your dinner if you've not already had it. Well, I haven't had mine, so I'm looking forward to mine. I hope you've taken something away from this evening, and may not be totally satisfied with some of the answers, but do speak to Southampton. They're not trying to, what's the word, screw the money out of you, you know, they're there to help you and talk to you and meet you halfway. Yeah, wherever possible, they're there to accommodate. So you never know, we might meet again, I don't know. There is a leasehold forum. The next meeting is on the 26th of April. We meet every 6 months, by the way. It is a forum that's there for you to ask questions, raise issues, meet halfway. So please do become part of that forum. Yeah. The next meeting will be Zoom because that's the way we are. But you never know. When we come out of COVID, it might be with chocolate biscuits and a cup of tea. So there we are. Bye, everyone. Have a good evening. Stay safe, stay well.
Cheerio, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.